Hi, I'm Susan Ritchie. I'm the professor of Unitarian Universalist History at the Starr King School for the Ministry and the UUA trustee from the Ohio Meadville District. And I'm happy to offer you today a history of the districts as they have functioned in our Unitarian Universalist Association. I'm speaking to you today from part of the mysterious border between the Ohio Meadville District and the Heartland District. And indeed, I'm assuming most of you have had the experience of trying to explain the geography of your district, which in case I'm imagining that you have suspected that the history of districts and how they took on the shape they have today is pretty darn complex. Districts do come out of the 1961 consolidation between the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association. But it was more than just a result of merger. It was also a negotiation that allowed for that merger to take place. And I think the most important thing to understand about districts is they never took on the form that their architects originally intended. So the original Unitarian Universalist Association Constitution called for intermediary structures between local congregations and the association. But that Constitution did not spell out what that intermediary structure would be. That was left up to a special committee, a committee that was called the Committee on Intermediary Organizations. The plural there is very important because no one imagined there would be only one structure between the National Association and the local congregation. So, as that committee began its work, what did they have to start with? Well, for one, they knew that they would not be following the Universalist system for state conventions. They knew that because the Unitarians would have resisted that profoundly. Universalist state conventions had a lot of powers that Unitarians insisted belong in the congregation. For example, the Universalist State Convention even ordained their own ministers. So we knew right away that the Universalist system wasn't going to be one to prevail in the new association. Also, there was the problem that the Universalist system of having state conventions wouldn't have worked west of the Mississippi, where there were actually only 2 Universalist state conventions. Well, then what about the Unitarian method of regional association? Would that prevail into the new UUA? And the answer there was also a clear absolutely not. The Unitarian system for regional organization was an absolute mess, the kind of mess you can only have when you're dealing with grassroots voluntary associations that pretty much sprung up on their own. For the system of Unitarian organization relied on local conferences, self-gathered conferences according to geography. And so there were many of these small conferences, for example, in New England, but not so many in the West and in other locations. And to make matters even more confusing, in the 1950s, these area conferences were combined into what became known as regional councils, which were served by regional directors. But the fact that that geography had never been thought through clearly made it pretty clear that the Unitarian system of association at the regional level was not going to work for the new association either. So, that committee made an original recommendation for 2 intermediary structures between the association and the congregation. There were going to be regional service centers, which would be run by Unitarian Universalist Association staff, and these service centers would provide to congregations direct services. And then there would also be districts. Districts were understood to be 40 to 75 congregations, which would not be the unit of service delivery, but rather the unit of governance. So interestingly enough, the districts were not intentionally meant to be the place where UUA services were delivered. Well, this 2-tiered system never took effect. Finances dictated that one or the other structures be manifested in the new association. And the choice of General Assembly was that it be the districts. And so the plan for districts went forward, but with a great deal of concern and ambivalence on a lot of people's parts. So how did the districts get structured? Well, congregations were free to choose what district they affiliated with. Rough district lines were drawn around geographic ideas. And it's interesting, though, that not all congregations made geographic choices in terms of the district they chose to affiliate. One interesting case here is San Juan, Puerto Rico, which chose to affiliate with the Metro New York district on the understanding that they shared a culture and a demographic more than they would with any other district. But alas, things were not well from the beginning. Some were concerned that these districts were going to be too small to stand up to what people presumed was the bureaucracy of the UUA. And on the other side, people assumed that the districts were going to fail to be in touch, that they were going to be too independent, and that they would operate in isolation of the UUA. And complicating matters, too, is the fact that many of the district executives who came to serve districts were people who had been prior Universalist State Convention superintendents and also directors of the Unitarian Regional Councils. And they were, to a man, ambivalent about this districting structure. In fact, most of them had opposed districting, just as in 1959, when the first serious vote towards merger was held. Most of them opposed merger. Something interesting happened. Between 1959 and 1961, we find all of those regional service directors actually moving towards supporting consolidation. Now, this is where we leave history for gossip, but there is some teeny evidence and a lot of gossip to suggest that AUA President Dana Greeley had talked to these folks and given them a bit of a deal that if they support consolidation, they would find themselves a good job in the newly created district. Not proof of that, but lots of indications. But we should return to the actual district. So the one concern about districts that seemed to get the most traction early on was this concern that districts were going to be too independent of the UUA. And this is where we get the proposed solution that districts elect their own board members to the UUA Board of Trustees. Prior to 1968, all of the UUA trustees were elected at large. But this proposal to have districts elect trustees was initiated as a way of trying to tie together the districts better to the Unitarian Universalist Association. And it's an interesting and slightly strange solution to try to use the body of one person to do this work of interconnection and interdependence. But in any case, it was then in 1968 that this was done. I think it's important to remember that having districts elect UUA trustees was never a matter of trying to ensure geographical representation. Sometimes it's talked about in that vein, but the fact of the matter was just trying to solve this perceived problem of the independence of districts. Well, so 1969 is, of course, as most of us know, the time of crisis in the UUA, and financial crisis was certainly a big part of that. The UUA was near literal bankruptcy, and so at that point a different decision had to be made about districts. The UUA did not have money to continue its support for district executive salaries. And so a new system was arrived at, the system of interdistrict representatives, where UUA staff members would serve regional groupings of several districts. Really, this was just a resurrection of the original committee's, original Committee on Intermediate Organizations model for service delivery. But it was pretty controversial at the time it was suggested. Many people interpreted this as an attempt for the UUA to grab some power and try to centralize away from the democratic grassroots. And indeed, for a while, some organizations on the West Coast actually withdrew from the UUA over this controversy. Eventually, things settled down, and it was after a decade and a half that this interdistrict program was replaced with the model we know now, which was a return to the original district system. The inter-district model had proved really unsustainable. It was under-resourced, and so there were really not staff available to appropriately serve their congregations. Well, that pretty much brings us up to the current date. But before I leave you, I just wanted to highlight some concerns that this history raises for me. Indeed, there are things that are quite disturbing to me about this history. For one, it's upsetting to me how often we've confused temporary strategies for sustainable institutions. It's upsetting to me how we've made plans but then neglected to revisit those plans when circumstances change. But most of all, the most distressing thing to me is if you knew only this history and not the theology of our movement, you would assume that we have no functional theology of interdependence. For we have assumed that a strong local unit can only compromise the power of a national association, and that is a good and appropriate way of balancing power. Similarly, we've also assumed that a strong national association compromises the power of local units, and again, that this is somehow a reasonable way of balancing power. What we are absolutely missing here is some sort of model for appropriately strong association. An association that is strong because its national entity is strong and because its regional entity is strong, and that the two together in health can truly serve our congregations better. Well, thank you for your interest in our history, and best of luck to you in your deliberations about the shape of our future.